Hello and welcome to the SportsGrad podcast. My name is Ryan Walker, and with me, as always, is the media man, Ruben Williams. How are you, mate?
G'day, Ryan. I'm fantastic as per usual. Another week of the pod, another fantastic guest. Some weeks where you really start to appreciate how lucky we are to get to chat with some of the people who come across our show. And today was absolutely no exception.
Yeah, you're dead right. It's really good reflective start to the pod. Some days you do just have to sit back and think, hey, there's some cool people that we talk to. This week is no different, as you just mentioned. So let's crack into it. But we can't continue without a quick word from our great friends at Deakin University, where every single course, Ruben, is backed by industry experts. So you can be confident you'll get the job you want with a degree that employers want. Deakin University, progressive real-world learning.
Ryan, this show is also brought to you by our good friends at Sports Where I Am. Give yourself a memorable summer to look forward to and head to sportswhereiam.com to find all your favorite sports. Plus, use the code SportsGrad and you can get 5% off your tickets. Head to their website. Fantastic platform. Plenty of sport going on there.
Absolutely. We love the guys at Sports Where I Am. If you want to learn more about who we are or want to ask us any questions, feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn. You can find a link to do so in the show notes or just search Ruben Williams, Ryan Walker will be on there. Now, Ruben, who is our guest today?
Ryan, I mentioned we get to talk with some pretty incredible people. Andrew Ryan is our guest today. Andrew is the managing director of FIBA Media. Now, FIBA Media is a joint venture between FIBA, of course, and DAZN, which encompasses all the rights, commercialization, production, and distribution of FIBA's premium events and leagues. Think, World Cups, that sort of thing. Prior to FIBA, Ryan, get this. Andrew was at the International Olympic Committee where he was the head of media working under legal and business affairs. And he was there for 4 years, where he would have crossed paths with our good friend Garth Town. And shout out to Garth. He will be listening for sure.
He'd have this on right away. He'd be the first listener, I reckon, Garth. So shout out to him.
Absolutely. So if Andrew's job at FIBA wasn't cool enough, he's already just come from an incredible one at the IOC. And then before that, Ryan, he was an M&A lawyer working out of London, New York, and the other massive city around the world, Brisbane. And since, massive law town.
Wow. You've had a riff at Brisbane there, haven't you? You've had a little.
I've put them in the same pile as London and New York.
I reckon you've had a little.
You know what all three? You know what all three of those cities have in common?
What?
They've all hosted the Olympics,
and
maybe New York hasn't. I'm not too sure actually, but
yeah,
they're all right up there.
We should know that. Do they all have a big river? Because the big brown snake is in Brisbane. London, they've got the Thames. What does New York have?
New York has got.
This is not good. We're on the record here. We don't know our geography well. I think New York's more ocean. To be honest, it's not a river.
We'll come back to that one.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Andrew, incredible guy from some of the biggest cities in the world and the biggest organizations in the world. And we had a fantastic discussion today. One of the things I loved about it, Ryan, was he talked about how to pitch media rights depending on the market. There's over 200 countries in the world and all these different markets that want to buy international basketball. And he talked about how they tailor their approach to different markets, different continents, depending on what is going on in each place.
Yeah, absolutely. I loved how he spoke about, just the future of what media rights looks like. Defined OTT for us, over the top. We'll remember that forever.
I've been waiting to ask somebody for that for a long time.
Yeah, and I could just essentially tell you what OTT means, but I'm going to leave Andrew to give you that definition, which is coming up shortly. But just the complexity of what that looks like, the days are gone where there's just a couple of broadcasters in the game and that's it. we've now got players like Amazon and Facebook, wanting to get into sports media rights. So the game has kind of changed forever, and it's really interesting hearing Andrew chat about that.
Mm. I also love just hearing about how they package up their media rights. You can buy the main event, but you can also buy these little extra bits as well to make the main event look a lot better and cut in a lot of different ways for certain platforms and whatnot. So, hearing how the FIBA media rights are served up was absolutely fascinating to get the details on. And very rare you actually find this out from anywhere else other than the source information.
Yep, absolutely. Well, let's get cracking. Grab a pen. Enjoy this chat with Andrew Ryan. Andrew, welcome to the SportsGrad podcast.
Hey, thanks, Ryan. Thanks, Ruben. Great to be with you guys today. Listened to the show a couple of times, actually. It's really had some great interviews on, in the last couple of months, and it's a great resource. So really pleased to be here.
Awesome. No, thank you very much. Well, we're very hopeful that this will turn out to be another one of those episodes, which we've got no doubt about. But one of the things that we love hearing about is how people enter the sports industry, a bit about their background, their ways of getting into the industry. We might start with a bit about your background. How did you end up working in sport?
Sure. Well, I won't go through the whole saga because being 40 years of age now, I'm probably a little bit older than a few of the people that you've had on the show. So my background professionally is as a lawyer. I went to University of Queensland and studied an LLB and a Bachelor of Arts specialising in psychology, and probably actually assumed that I would end up in sports psychology more so than getting into the legal field. But for various reasons, moving into the legal field in Brisbane was the way forward, and what I chose to do, and that ended up getting me a move to London. After a while, did a little bit of time in New York and Los Angeles, which probably makes it sound a bit more glamorous than it really was, but eventually ended up in the world of media, working for a radio station in the United Kingdom called Absolute Radio, and in a pretty nice bit of timing, they had their first acquisition of commentary rights for the Premier League football, going on probably only a couple of months after I turned up. And it was there that I got to meet a few people who were in the sports media industry, and was probably the first time that I really thought about the concept of having a career in sport. I think sport had always been an incredibly important thing for me and my family growing up, and certainly I think far and away what I would describe as my main passion, for lack of a better description. And so that opportunity of meeting a few people who had made their way into that world already certainly gave me the insight that yes, this was a possible thing to do. So I stepped in and did a postgraduate course in sports law at a university in the UK. Ended up coming out with the top marks out of that, which gave me a pretty reasonable selling point to pitch myself to various organisations.
That's pretty handy when you can say the Ducks.
Yeah.
I mean, out of a class of about 15, it's like
take it though.
I mean, people only need to know the headline. They don't need to know the details.
You didn't need to say there was only 15 in the class there. We would have thought you were the best ever.
Fortunately, that was 10 years ago. So, in the interest of transparency, we'll lay it out on the table. But also had some great help from some the sports law profession in the UK is a really generous one, and there were 2 or 3 people in particular who gave me a massive boost just in terms of instruction, support, introduction to contacts, and the like, which made me genuinely believe there was an opportunity there that I could eventually take advantage of, and ended up in a company called Perform Sports Media, which was probably not hugely known at the time, but was moving its way into probably being the biggest digital sports company in the world. Had interests across website development, betting content, both data and video, getting into the OTT sort of subscription service area, and from there I just got the greatest grounding possible in terms of the modern way that sports content is commercialized. And Perform eventually has gone on to become DAZN, which is probably the leading independent sports streamer in the world now. Has expanded to a number of countries, and is now has a global approach to its operation. I'm sure it will only keep getting bigger, and so that's pretty much the potted history of making the jump from sort of being traditional corporate and commercial lawyer into the sports world.
It's quite a story. I'm interested around, you said you've obviously got the law background and you did sports law at university and postgrad. How did you go from knowing, law back to front, but you didn't know media rights back to front? So how did you go from knowing a little bit to everything? Was that like a really long process once you got in, or was it sort of covered pre sort of when you started working?
Yeah, I think knowing law back to front's probably more generous than some of my ex-partners would describe my capabilities. But I think there's a couple of aspects to it. I think being a major sports fan, and not just a sports fan, but a fan of the business of sport, and that probably sounds a little bit lame, but I think since I was a kid, I'd always had an interest in why certain sports were popular. I had an interest in why the broadcasting of the National Rugby League or the New South Wales Rugby League back in the day went from Channel 10 to Channel 9, and what precipitated that. Had an interest in how sports was delivered as a media product. So I think there's a lot of stuff that was certainly not unfamiliar once I jumped into the sports world. It wasn't like it was coming at it from a place of no background or never having given any thought to this whatsoever. So it was, to be honest, it was probably more uncomfortable going from the world of corporate law into music and radio and all of the technicalities that come around the licensing and management of a media property like that than it was jumping into the world of sports and media rights acquisition. I think most of that came pretty naturally and all made sense to me pretty quickly. And we also had the advantage of Perform, that a lot of the areas that we were getting into, like the licensing of betting data and some of the stuff that we were doing with the Premier Leagues and the FA's data code at the time, was really on the cusp of creating new industries or new commercial models. And so you were almost having to use some principled knowledge to help drive the setup of these things in the first place. So it wasn't like you were coming to an area that had a monumental amount of complexity that you were never going to be able to get your head around. In fact, one of the advantages of going into sports media is that actually the fundamentals of it are not shockingly complex. Actually, the most important thing is more standard practice and how you get things done in an efficient period of time by asking the right questions and getting the right changes through in documents or structures. And so from that part, it wasn't an incredibly difficult transition.
So what led to you ending up at FIBA? Was it a couple of decisions you made along the way, or did your interest just kind of naturally pull you along to this position?
So certainly natural interest in basketball, but I think that's probably the least relevant part of the story. When I left Perform the Zone, I went to the International Olympic Committee and worked there for 4 years, heading up their legal and business affairs unit for media.
Pretty tidy title at a tidy organisation.
It's not a bad one to carry on the CV, and there was a part of me that's what attracted me in the first place. But actually, in the 4 years there, it was a great place to work, and certainly met really really good people who are highly dedicated, high quality individuals along the way. But one of the final major deals I did before moving to the ISC was actually setting up a venture with a bunch of people from Perform on the one side of FIBA, on the other side, to set up FIBA Media, which was a long-term joint venture between Perform and FIBA. Is lasting for 17 years. Was set up back in 2016. So I already knew all of the characters that were involved in the FIBA Media venture. They still are there for the most part. And I'd gotten to the point with the Olympic Committee work that I really enjoyed being a part of the Olympic movement, so to speak. I absolutely love the Olympics as a concept and as an event. But over a number of years, I think I'd probably, as much as my base title was a lawyer, I'd really pushed myself into the commercial sphere and the digital strategy sphere. And there were probably elements there where I felt like I was contributing pretty strongly to what was happening internally, but probably just almost incapable of getting the recognition for it, or incapable of necessarily getting to lead some of those projects just by virtue of what my role was. So there came a point that I thought, okay, if I want to extend myself and if I want to push myself into a role that is more of a commercial / management one, then I've probably got to keep an eye out for what's available. And just a late night conversation with one of my old team from Perform back in a quick trip to London. He mentioned that they were actually looking for a new managing director for FIBA Media, and hadn't quite found the person they were looking for. So I put my head into the ring, and it all actually happened pretty quickly after that. And knowing all of the different people involved, having a pretty good knowledge of international basketball, already being located in Switzerland, it was all quite an incredibly it couldn't have been set up much better. I don't want to say it was a marriage of convenience by any stretch, but there were certainly a lot of elements that made it very easy for me to say yes, and probably easier for them to bring me on board.
So you're working with Perform. They do a joint venture with FIBA. You then go off to the Olympics, and then your contacts at Perform bring you back into FIBA, and here you are now.
Yeah, you've summarised it far more effectively than I did.
Bruce has done like a little 10-second summary of the answer.
That's a subtle indication of, Andrew, keep your answers a little bit shorter so we can pump on with the podcast.
No, I love the details. I'm just trying to get my head around the series of events, and I love hearing about how, if you don't go back to London and you don't have that coffee, you probably don't even know that FIBA are advertising for that role. So
it's good reason to also always treat your people well as well.
Yeah.
The guy that I was talking to there, Tom Burrows, was part of my legal team back at Perform, going back many years beforehand. One of the best young lawyers and subsequently commercial operators that there is in the sports industry, and we obviously maintained contact as both friends and professional colleagues. And that is, once you start developing those relationships and those trusted relationships, then obviously there's more opportunity for those things to happen in the future. So yes, I think is a fundamental for anyone who's listening to that, who's on the cusp of this sort of career, already in there. Then absolutely you want to make sure that you look after people and cultivate proper and authentic relationships as you move through.
And for those who don't quite understand, what do you mean by a joint venture? One of the other joint ventures that happened closer to Australia was between Channel 9 and Cricket Australia. But what does it mean by an international body and an outside organisation having a joint venture?
I'd probably go as far as saying the joint venture between DAZN and FIBA is a far more deeper one than the Cricket Australia arrangements. The FIBA at the time had a pretty strong base in terms of a great interest in world and international basketball across many countries, but was implementing some major changes to their structure in terms of games, introduction of pretty detailed qualifiers processes, a lot of home and away content for broadcasters to work with and for national federations. And this all got packaged up into something where they wanted to bring a media partner on board, partially for economic reasons of being able to give some long-term financial security, partially for investment reasons of being able to really, I guess, not just devote money, but certainly time and expertise to take the product forward in a way which would enable it to move into being either a particular top tier event in major countries, but also just be looked upon as a really first class product from a media standpoint, and particularly in the world of basketball, where you're not necessarily competing against the NBA, but certainly that's what people will compare you to. It's very important for FIBA to be able to put out broadcast content that has a certain fundamental quality to it, so that it shapes up well in comparison. So that joint venture, without going into confidential details of it, is a contractual joint venture. So it's not, we haven't created a separate entity called FIBA Media. That is the media brand that we use for commercial purposes and for production purposes, but it is underlying a contractual agreement between FIBA and DAZN, which looks at the obligations and the benefits that come from the production of that content, the distribution of that content, the commercialization of it in terms of the sale of the media rights, and who benefits and in what way from the I guess, the exploitation of that from a financial perspective.
Okay, cool. So they pay for the right to produce and sell basketball internationally.
Yeah, they do, and it's done, and I guess that's why we tend to always refer to it as a joint venture or a partnership. It's very much not a here you go, here are these rights for Form, now DAZN, which I'll just refer to it from now on because it's easier. Go and license them, do your best, come back and talk to us when you've got some cash. Actually, the complete opposite. There is a lot of coordination. I sit in the FIBA offices itself. I will probably speak to the various FIBA teams, whether it's across the media and marketing management or the COO or the internal communications team, probably actually more than I do the DAZN commercial team, who actually look after the sale of the rights in most countries. So it's a joint venture and a partnership very much in substance as it is in name, and I think that's probably why it was seen as one of the more innovative partnerships at the time, because it was really taking away that traditional sports approach of federation on the one hand saying, here is a group of assets, you go and do your best with them, and we expect a base financial commitment in the form of a guarantee or something of that ilk that will attach to that and give us financial security. It's moved very much into the sphere of two parties working together and bringing what they have in terms of resources to try to not only exploit those rights as effectively and more effectively than they have in the past, but also to try to push the product forward as much as possible.
Let's dig a bit deeper into media rights specifically. So your role as MD is obviously to sell broadcast and generate revenue for FIBA and the sport. What are the first steps that you take to basically package FIBA's media rights up?
It's a good question. So FIBA's interesting compared to, I guess, properties that have a strong domestic slant, which will really influence the way that certainly if whether it's the Premier League or the NRL or the AFL, your domestic market is by far the most important thing that will guide all of your decision making about what you do in terms of production, what you do in terms of carved out rights, what you do in terms of digital platforms and how to exploit those as effectively as possible. And everything thereafter is not an afterthought, but certainly secondary to what you're doing there. As an international sport, and in particular one that's got interest across a range of territories. I mean, there is territories where we're genuinely a top tier property and a hugely beneficial property for broadcasters to have. There are other places where it's a really, really positive or nice thing to have, whether to complement a basketball strategy, complement an Olympic sports strategy. And there's others where either basketball is developing property or the interest in the national team is low at the moment or still developing. So, broadly, there are many different markets, types of markets that we will go into. In terms of packaging it, the available content is not necessarily the most complex part of that. So we tend to work on 4-year cycles. That encompasses the Men's World Cup, the Women's World Cup, the qualifiers for each of those World Cups, qualifiers on the men's side for continental events, all of the different continental events such as Eurobasket or Afrobasket. And I guess that's where we genuinely differ from a FIFA, for instance, that FIBA controls both the continental media rights as well as the global media rights. So we can offer a package of content that is actually pretty comprehensive across a 4-year slate, which is not something that's particularly common in media rights sales for international federations. So that package, whether or not we just tend to do the global events plus the European events for European broadcasters, or we work with someone to make available the entire slate of content across the 4 years. That's not the most complex part. The most complex part is more about how it is that we take it to market in the first place in order to drive as much, in particular, competition as we can. And fundamentally, as much as you will see plenty of analysis as to how various broadcasters will put together bids for media rights, and it's always an intriguing thing to read, particularly in Europe, around the Premier League and people calling Sky or any other broadcast silly, for lack of a better description, for what they pay. There's an incredible amount of complexity that goes into developing those amounts. It's certainly not just a case of broadcaster X will generate Y revenue from advertising or necessarily directly linked subscriptions for that product. It's having a premium property on your service. It's the ability to bring blue chip advertisers because you're giving them exposure around some top tier content, and you can spread that revenue across a wider part of the service. If you're someone like Sky, your customers, leaving aside the digital approach, have to acquire a basic package for that for Sky, in addition to having the sports pack that goes on top. So if you're Sky, your Premier League relevant revenues are also partially what you get from just having people who buy that basic package because they're essentially forced to. So it's a really quite complex mix, but at the end of the day, probably the greatest influence on it is how much competition there is in the market, and whether that is real or perceived, and what the threats are coming from broadcasters, from the other major players in their market, whether they're trying to establish a basketball strategy or they've got a new investor who's supporting the acquisition of first or second tier content. So our job is less about necessarily trying to work out precisely what that package of events is, but more about how do we actually shape those discussions to generate as much competitive tension as we can.
Yeah.
So you're selling the same group of assets into multiple markets, is that right?
Correct. And we will do that sometimes on a country by country basis. Sometimes, as you listeners probably well know, that you have broadcasters who will operate across full regions, whether that's the MENA, Middle East, North Africa, or Sub-Saharan Africa. Or in some case, we work with an agency, Torneos, who manages all the rights across Latin America, and some of that will be broadcasted on a multi-country basis. Some of that they will do on a territory by territory basis. But essentially, yes, it's the same events, or at least a subset of those same events, that is being taken to market in each of those territories, rather than necessarily doing a huge amount of picking and choosing of what might work in one place and what might not in another. And I guess that's the advantage that FIBA has with that too, is that those events that might be stronger in a particular country, we can leverage those to bring up the visibility of others. So for instance, in a country like Belgium, actually, the women's team is actually traditionally over the last recent times, a very, very strong team. There's a lot of interest in the women's national team. The men's team is certainly on the up, but not on the same level as consistent international performance. And actually, it's our ability to use that interest in the women's team as a lever to actually push up the visibility, and the support that's given to the men's team is really important. And there's other countries where that will be the opposite, of where you're really using the men's team and the big events like the World Cup to give a push to some of the women's events.
So how many people do you end up dealing with? Because, there's over 200 countries in the world, and there's multiple broadcasters in all of them, and you're selling the same group to, hopefully reaching into every country in the world. How many different radio stations, TV stations, the rest of it, do you end up dealing with?
There's a fair few. Fortunately, it's not me who is doing all the work. And to be honest, actually, in terms of leading those conversations, I tend to turn up more towards the end for a glorious handshake than necessarily getting into the weeds of negotiation. No, that's true in some places, certainly. But we have a group within DAZN called the Broadcast Partnerships Team, and there are a range of or a whole team of salespeople there who represent not DAZN in terms of the streaming organisation, but actually represent all of the different partnerships that DAZN has. So in addition to FIBA, there's a wider partnership with the WTA. There's a partnership with European Handball. There's some marketing of various NFL rights. So that group will have a specialization in particular territories or particular countries. And one of the big advantages for us with that structure is that those guys are able to leverage their knowledge and their relationships from many, many properties to try to drive the best result overall for that, for each of the ventures. So you might have some properties where they have a very strong relationship as a result of women's tennis being particularly popular because of a key player being in that country, and that will actually help us in discussions. For the FIBA rights, very often it's also the opposite. We have FIBA being used as a property which will generate a lot of interest and generate a lot of relationships from one sales process, and then that's able to be leveraged for others. So that spread of people with specific geographic knowledge and specific relationships in particular territories is a really, really important part of how we do it as effectively as we do.
So it sounds like it goes through quite a few sets of hands before it actually gets to the viewer.
It does. I think one of the great things about that way that team works is that we do. So saying we take it on a market basis a bit trite. There's very rarely you'd say anything different, but our ability to collaborate as a group, our ability to bring different knowledge sets to each market, our ability to bring different relationships from each market is really, really important. And there'll be some markets, whether for political reasons or for relationship reasons, that I might get involved a lot more. There'll be others where it's literally taking a backseat, and our commercial sales head will essentially, we'll talk about the market, we'll talk about who the likely players are, but for the most part, that they will generally drive the strategy and the approach and leverage those relationships they already have in that market. So it's a matter of trying to do what's the best for the wider organisation as part of each of those countries. And because we sell on a consistent 4-year basis, so we've got our new cycle starting at the end of November, all of this has to happen in a reasonably narrow period of time. So we over the last 18 months have gone through basically the entire FIBA sales process, which is probably not the optimal time to have been selling media rights, given the impacts of the pandemic and what that's done to both budgets and commercial revenues across most countries in the world. And it's a major credit to the whole team that we've managed to come out with some very, very good results, and both some renewals with existing strong broadcasters and bringing some new ones on board that'll really help drive the visibility and the packaging of FIBA forward.
You mentioned that the 4-year cycle you go through. How connected are you with, say, the team who runs the competitions? Because you'll be having conversations with broadcasters out there who might want a certain product. You know what I mean? Like they might want a tournament somewhere in the mix that didn't exist in the last 4 years. So like, how do you come to terms with like what the broadcaster wants compared to like what FIBA can deliver?
Yeah, actually, interesting question. I guess there's very little we can do in terms of putting an event in a particular place. I mean, certainly when FIBA comes to the point of deciding who will be the hosts of major events, then the broadcast picture or the broadcast landscape in that country is a very, very important one. And obviously, when they put something in a particular part of the world, whether that be China for the 2019 World Cup or Japan, Indonesia, and Philippines for the 2023 Men's World Cup, there's an expectation that will result in a strong media arrangement, both in terms of the economics that sit behind it, but also what it will do for basketball and international basketball in that country. In terms of the interaction with other departments, certainly with the FIBA internal competitions team, we have a very, very strong and very frequent level of interactions. We will get involved in everything from tip-off times, sometimes getting into views on particular venues in countries, less about that on a strategic position, but more about just for production responsibilities and arrangements that come with it. So on that level, there's a substantial level of interaction. Depending on the event, we will get more or less involved with direct interactions with the organising committee. So certainly with the Women's World Cup coming up in Sydney in 2022, given that's been on the horizon, given that it's also linked with our sales processes out in Australia, we have interacted quite frequently with the local organising committee out there to make sure that we get something that works for everyone and is a strong result for FIBA as a whole. So that will all happen in a fairly natural and organic way. In terms of the broadcasters, there's a basic product that goes out, which is the world feed, and everyone has to take that and rebroadcast it as part of their coverage. There's not a huge amount of flexibility that goes with that, although obviously we will always take on board new trends or comments that are coming from broadcasters to make sure that that's as good a product as possible. Where we try to give them as much I guess, whether it's bespoke assistance or otherwise, that we have a really, really big supporting content slate, and whether that's preview videos, whether that's explainers of how tournaments work, individual player profiles, highlights clips across both traditional highlights packages and individual player clips and the like, which is all made available via the cloud to broadcast partners and under the guise of you take these basic assets and you use them in the way that is most effective for your strategy, whether that's on a linear or a digital/social media basis. So it's more about trying to put those assets in the hands of the broadcast partners and support them in that way, rather than necessarily doing a huge amount of bespoke or individual tailoring of work.
Is that consistent across a lot of sports, like giving those packages to the broadcasters go and use, or would they have to go and create them or do their own shoots or that kind of thing?
Yeah, very, very much a sport by sport basis. I
Yeah.
think we've got a well funded and well resourced team that manages this. That's obviously one of the strengths of the FIBA media operation. I think that the concept of making available highlights packages is not necessarily an outrageously innovative thing, but because of our relationship with a company called WSC and because of the effort that we put into producing this, we can deliver a high volume and a high mixture of content that probably exceeds what a lot of sporting organisations are able to do. We've also invested in a couple of things around digital marketing, both on the one hand, support for broadcaster marketing activity, where we actually work hand in hand with the broadcasters to potentially either co-create or sometimes co-push marketing materials, taking the view that we'd much rather have an active hand in trying to make sure that the broadcasters are promoting FIBA content, knowing they have plenty of other content that they've got the option to push at any time. And also a player and influencer program where we will work with influencers in key markets or with players from a lot of countries to either, once again, co-create or push them content, all under the guise of trying to increase the visibility and the recognition of the FIBA events, or if the strategic approach is trying to push to a particular broadcaster. So there's a lot of what FIBA does that is probably a stretch, particularly for an international federation, but probably even almost operating a little bit more like you would a typical professional sports league.
This is relating a bit to your old world, Ryan, but it's kind of similar to how Qantas might sponsor Cricket Australia, but on top of just sponsoring the cricket, that they've then got to spend money to activate their partnership. That they've got to put money into running fan engagement activities around the ground so that their partnership actually looks good. In a similar way, these countries are buying the world feed, but then they need to do more to make sure it looks good. And you can either make it look good on your own, or you can buy the extra package from FIBA, who have got their own way of making it look good.
Yeah, I think the one of the and you will find that in a lot of discussions with broadcasters, and particularly when you're trying to push for the highest rights fee possible, because at the end of the day, that's a large chunk of how an organisation like FIBA and most sports organisations make money. That there is very much recognition that the broadcasters not only invest in the product, whether from doing their own studio shows, sending their own commentary teams to major events, having their own personalities work to promote it, but also a lot of work, obviously, in sort of more standard promotion, whether through their own services or otherwise. And that level of investment is something that is a huge benefit to the sport. And it's always funny when you look at people who will tout the concept of, these sports should just go all direct to consumer themselves. They should just launch their own OTT service. I'm personally a massive fan of digital delivery content, and absolutely very much someone who will push the ability to have, particularly all content available at your fingertips through that sort of dedicated service. But there is sometimes a lack of recognition of the value that comes from those partnerships with third-party broadcasters that have services that are running, 24/7, 365, and the resources that they put behind promoting content, that when you do not have those relationships, then all of that marketing and promotion essentially sits in your hand as the rights holder. And so you get these sort of almost awkward analyses of, yes, if you went and put your own Premier League OTT service together, that you could make X million dollars off the back of it, simply because this many people watch the Premier League and they would pay $80 a year, for instance. It's an absolutely garbage analysis. There is an incredible amount of resource and expertise that's required to run your own media operation effectively, and particularly when it comes to the marketing of that content and actually convincing people to separate with their hard-earned cash and something like that. Not to say that it can't be done, but it's more so just the lack of recognition of the complexity that comes with making that a success.
For those who haven't heard of the term OTT, can you explain a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, OTT comes from over the top, and it's a bit of an old school term that sort of sometimes gets mixed up with terms like D2C and the like, which is direct to consumer. An OTT service is basically an internet delivered service that does not form part of a pre-existing broadcast distribution service. I mean, typically you would, whether you're broadcasting across the old airwaves back in the day, which you young bucks may not necessarily remember, or using digital terrestrial television delivery, or satellite, or cable, which is very, very popular in the States. They're all sort of traditional forms of broadcast television delivery, whereas OTT relies on delivery through the public internet.
So you guys are like the pinnacle of international sport, and you've got all these different packages that you can sell the rights into multiple different countries. Surely everyone wants a piece of you. How do you go about then putting together the FIBA pitch? Like, what are the key components for you guys to sell your product?
Yeah. I was going to say, the pinnacle of international sport, I might bring you onto our marketing team, Reuben. That's I might use that one from now on. Once again, it will very much be a market by market thing. So take Australia for the moment. We had, in terms of the sales process there, we had a couple of strong points which we're able to bring to our pitches. One is that first and foremost, that there is the Women's World Cup in Sydney next year, and so having a major world event on your on home soil, or home hardwood, as we might say for basketball, is a really great selling point for a package to start with. Over and above that, Australia has a critical mass of not just NBA players, but a number of NBA players who are having pretty consistent success over there. A couple of them, certainly, at least Josh Giddey at the moment, having a great start to his rookie season. And so there's both established stars and shoots of huge future promise, and of individual athletes that probably resonate very much with a particular demographic that a broadcaster is either trying to retain or trying to attract as part of what they're doing. And so in a country like Australia, there's a strong history of recognition of the Boomers and Opals names, but at the moment, actually, leaving aside the success in the Olympics, actually some of those individual athletes are very, very prominent in the sports media space. And so that was probably just as much a focus of what we were doing, as opposed to promoting the fact that you can be the home of the national team, you can be the home of the FIBA World Cup and the FIBA Women's World Cup, and so they're very much brands that FIBA has invested in heavily to try to promote as genuine premium products in the sports world. There will be other countries where, irrespective of individual talents, actually there is a big association with the national team. In particular, large parts of Europe, it tends to be the men's national team, and even when there is a fluctuation in the performance of that. So I mean, Lithuania is a good example. I mean, Lithuania is one of the craziest basketball markets on the planet. The national team, despite having a couple of good quality NBA players in it, is probably being a little bit more down than up. And that's obviously against their traditional lofty standards, but the national team is still a massive, massive brand within that territory. And so pitching this as the home of the Lithuanian national team, and actually the deal that we did was across the whole Baltics. So obviously it involved Latvia and Estonia as well. And Latvia's got a tremendous basketball history too. It's more about promoting that as being the home of the national team. One of the other elements probably two other elements that we're really pushing this cycle, is that international basketball is a place where you can find a lot of the, I guess, the generationally most important athletes that are running around today. And obviously, the overwhelming majority of those will play in the NBA, but they are also featuring, particularly at the top tier FIBA events as well. And there is a group of young players, whether Giannis Antetokounmpo from Greece or Luka Doncic from Slovenia and the like, that are known across the world, that are huge individual personalities in their own right, but also hugely dedicated to playing for their national team. And the fact that you can take to a broadcaster that it's not just a case of your national team being the be all and the end all of this package, but you're actually getting access to a whole range of games that involve some of the biggest sporting superstars on the planet.
You're right around Doncic, and I'm not even going to try and say Giannis's last name, but like basketball, they seem like they're very loyal. Like they all really want to play for the national team. Like I feel like it's probably not even true. It's probably just an observation from me. But like you're halfway through a Premier League season and there's an international break and it's a friendly, and I feel like half the guys are like, well, I don't want to get injured because I've got Premier League next week. But I feel like basketball, they all like put the country on their back and they're all happy to play, which is one of the coolest things about international basketball, I find. But it's probably wrong, but it's just an observation.
No, well, actually, it's nice to have that recognition, Ryan, because I think there's a lot of people who might just have a passing interest in basketball, or whose interest is defined largely by the NBA, that probably actually don't recognise that point, and it's maybe one that we're more easily exposed to from following Australia, because you have got that core group of Mills and Ingles and Baines and a few others that have developed actually what is a pretty remarkable culture of dedication to the national team. And they are a group that almost create a bit of an aspirational culture in terms of, as you as a sports fan look and think, man, if I was on a team, that's exactly the sort of group that I would want to be a part of. And you've hit the nail on the head with guys like Doncic, for instance, that they come from countries where basketball is the premier national team sport. And whether there's other countries where it's probably level with football, there's other where it might be the second team behind football, but where basketball is a major sport growing up, where the national team property is something that families will get around and watch on TV in the same way that the British will watch the England team go out and run onto the pitch in Euro events and the like. And it's culturally just a massive thing. And so for those players to come back after lengthy domestic or NBA seasons and play for their national team is probably not just expected, but it is something that they feel very, very deeply inside. And victories or successes that they have with those teams are hugely important to them, even compared to their NBA duties.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I'm really keen to hear about is the relationship between FIBA and the NBA. On one hand, the NBA is pretty much your best friend, and then on the other hand, they're also your biggest competitor. So how do you work together?
So I guess first and foremost, FIBA and the NBA have actually an exceptionally strong relationship. So we actually have the Deputy Commissioner, Mark Tatum, sits on the FIBA Central Board, and which is quite it sounds incredibly sensible on the surface. On the other hand, there's also not that many international federations that would take that higher view and say, okay, actually this league in the world of basketball is massive. It is the biggest property that exists in club basketball. And rather than actually try to fight against that, actually say, this is an incredibly important thing for the global development of basketball. The NBA has had a number of people, whether it was ranging from David Stern back in the day and certainly Adam Silver now, who are hugely behind the concept of international basketball and what FIBA does being a really important part of developing basketball across the globe, which is certainly something that benefits them from a commercial perspective, but also means that they have the opportunity to develop new fans for the sport in general. And FIBA's very, very well positioned to not help. That is FIBA's mission, to grow and develop the game of basketball. So on that front, actually, from a governance perspective, it's a really effective relationship. And The NBA is very supportive of players participating in, whether it's global or continental events. Certainly, the NBA schedule makes it difficult for players to be involved in certain games, but the FIBA calendar and the NBA calendar actually work together quite well. In terms of cooperation on a content level, actually, I probably talk to the content team from the NBA sort of once every couple of weeks, maybe once a month, depending on what part of the year it's in. We collaborate in terms of not necessarily co-creation of content, but certainly exchanging of ideas and strategies on the digital marketing and the social media front, which has been a really, really beneficial thing that's happened in more recent times. And I guess when it comes down to the fundamentals of our media rights strategy, I guess we're slightly different than, for instance, FINA with swimming rights or FEI with equestrian rights. And the fact that for countries where basketball is still a developing property, the NBA is a pretty damn good battering ram to go in there and actually, through its incredible exposure, the cachet that comes with that league, the wonderful way it's presented and marketed, it has the capacity to develop new audiences in a way that FIBA just by itself could not. There's obviously a lot of those countries were also pushing very hard to generate an interest in national teams as well. But those two angles work pretty well together in terms of trying to bring basketball up from a level of interest and level of fandom that if it was just one or the other would not be nearly as effective. So from that NBA FIBA perspective, it's a really, really strong and exciting relationship too. I think both organisations can do so much more working together than they can individually.
So will you go into deals together saying you can buy the rights to the NBA and FIBA together?
No, not at all. So we will distinctly sell our rights separately. So certainly we will keep an eye on what's happened with NBA rights in a territory. I suspect that ex-US they will probably be very aware of what we're doing as well, and that's just as much to see who it probably more as to see who is developing a specific basketball strategy. And whether or not you have a country where 2 or 3 major properties are ending up on the same service, or alternatively, there's a bit of a spread of the major basketball properties across one or more broadcasters.
Just on, one of the specifics of the commercial realities of it, do you go in just trying to pitch the prestige and patriotism of FIBA events, or do you have to spell out to some of these broadcasters exactly what sort of return they can expect if they buy your rights?
Good question, Ruben. So I think we'll sometimes, but very rarely, do we get in trying to literally explain what we think the pure value is for a broadcaster. And there's probably a couple of reasons for that. No one knows the broadcaster's business like they do.
Dangerous.
Secondly, it is a dangerous area to get into because actually, and I'll go back to my Sky example from beforehand, that actually the value that comes to a broadcaster is a very, very complex thing, and you almost don't want to undercut the value that you're potentially bringing to them because you've actually missed part of their strategy. So we will try not to get into that too much. Certainly, what we want to do is try to find essentially what the broadcaster's baseline is, see if we can generate a premium for the rights based on a certain level of competition. Rather than necessarily getting into the nitty gritty of what it is that we think they're valuing the content as. Where we have tried to get into more an educative phase, particularly over the last 18 months, is on that basis that competition is really what helps us drive value from markets. Is that in markets where we thought or knew there was probably likely one broadcaster who would pursue the rights aggressively, we looked at trying to develop not only relationships, but certainly actually bringing to mind the benefits of a FIBA basketball package with broadcasters who might be less familiar with the product. And so there were certain outreach efforts, both on a personal level and sending certain materials to them in order to just try to generate almost like creating a lead in a certain way of saying, actually, maybe we need to take a step back and actually get certain organizations familiar with what FIBA basketball is, what really it looks like as a media property, what are the reasons it can be a property that will work for that service, whether or not targeting a certain demographic or giving them a certain bulk of content to help with a developing OTT strategy or something like that. So that was part of what we proactively did as almost a lead into the sales processes in a number of countries.
Unreal. And so, like, you hear a lot about these new players come to the table, like Facebook, Amazon, looking to buy sports media rights. What do you think the future looks like?
I mean, from a media rights sales perspective, certainly the more buyers you have in a market is a really good thing. As you get a greater and greater adoption of people either subscribing to digital services or just getting used to the fact that there is a range of places that they will get that content, and certainly the adoption of things like Amazon Prime and Netflix over a number of years now has meant that your average consumer is actually pretty used to the fact that they might have to press an app button or go into a different digital environment to get content. So I think that has become much less of a barrier than it once was. I think and the consideration that we will always have when we're looking at selling to someone who might make available content purely through an OTT play, for instance, is what will that do for the visibility of the content? And that's not necessarily saying, oh, they're a digital service, so they will have less consumers. There are plenty of digital sports services, and DAZN is a great example of that, have built really significant audiences in a number of high value territories. It's more a case of you get certain OTT services that are just really overloaded with content. And back in the day, if you're relying on a linear television service, at some point in that schedule, you will be featured on the electronic programming guide. You will have priority on channel 1, channel 2, whatever it is. In an OTT service, it is possible to get lost if your content is not being prioritized, because how they make available that content, through typical menus, like it is possible that you can end up in the middle of nowhere, and it's almost like a tree falling in a forest that no one knows about. So it's that's probably one of the bigger sort of assessments we will do if we're working for someone on that basis, and whether or not that involves certain visibility or marketing commitments that come with it, just to make sure that we have FIBA as a priority property at some stage. I think to take, I guess, more the sort of fundamental of looking at the future of media. The strategies from the various organisations, whether it was Facebook, who everyone thought was going to come into, not everyone, but a lot of people thought were going to come strongly into the sports rights acquisition mix, or you've had Amazon, who have done some fairly selective deals in certain parts of the world, but certainly haven't unleashed a genuine Amazon sports strategy on a global basis. I think those things will continue to develop. I mean, each of those organizations is more than strong enough without sport as one of their verticals. On the other hand, sport is still the programming that retains this remarkable level of passion and dedication and almost bankability that no other content has. The interest in an X Factor style program will wane after a certain period of time, or a drama series or a comedy series. You might have a bankable star, but it only takes some poor quality programming, or that person sort of going out of the consciousness, and all of a sudden you've paid for something that doesn't really have a great amount of value. Sport is a pretty bankable property, and even when in those high value football leagues, for instance, even when your team's a bit garbage, you can still guarantee that there is going to be a certain level of interest in viewership. So it is still a fundamentally important part of a media strategy, and those services will continue to evolve over time, but I don't see them getting less involved in sport.
Fantastic. Just need to make sure you have a good relationship with the person to make sure you're on the front page of the menu.
Yeah.
Front page of the menu is a nice way to describe it.
Yeah. All right. Well, Andrew, we might leave it there, but that was a genuinely awesome. I think we're at 53 minutes, and I genuinely think we could go for a bit longer. There's deep diving into media rights, but just hearing about your journey, firstly to get in there's a bit of a longer story in there, I think, around your little US trip, but we'll leave that for another day. But no, we just loved your insight into media rights. I've learned a bit, even despite working with CA for 4 years. I didn't deep dive into media rights, but it's been awesome to chat to you, and great to hear how FIBA is just continuing to kick goals. And I'm looking forward to one day the Boomers coming back down under, and we'll be there watching for sure, Rubes. But thanks so much again, and good luck.
No, really, really great to talk to you guys. And I think the media rights space is probably almost the most interesting one from a commercial activity sphere these days. So I mean, for all of your listeners out there, it's certainly almost fundamental that you need to know how this space works if you're looking to get into the commercial activity of the sports sphere. But it's also a really, really interesting area to get into. So hugely encourage everyone to do as much reading and as much thinking about this area as they can.
Just quickly, we've got as much time as we want to allow. So, you mentioned right at the start how your interest in this space was, peaked by just watching the NRL and seeing where the rights of that fell. These days, what do you think people can do to start to, feed their interest in this space?
That's an awesome question. So I guess it's funny when you mentioned about the NRL, and I guess what sort of first piqued my interest. You guys are probably too young to remember, but actually both the NRL or the New South Wales Rugby League back in the day and the AFL had in the, I think it was either really late 80s, certainly early 90s, just two of the best advertising campaigns that I've ever seen in the world of sport. And that was on the rugby league side, a pair of Tina Turner songs, and particularly the Simply the Best commercial that ran for probably about 3 or 4 years, that just completely and utterly repositioned rugby league as, in the 80s, hardcore working man sport in some pretty downtrodden venues, into this game where you were getting probably upwards of 35-40% of spectators as women, really almost sexualizing the game to a certain extent to achieve that purpose. Maybe probably approach might not go down as well today, or might be less well interpreted. And then on the AFL side, you had the series of unbelievable commercials that brought in stars from across the world. So there's a part of me that does one sometimes. I think almost that art of mass communication and mass promotion of sporting properties has almost been lost in the social media age, and whether that's that people see budgets are just much more effectively used in through digital promotion and otherwise. I think it's a bit of a shame. I think that is still one method of really, really actually positioning your product to the masses and almost changing a perception of what something is, and maybe less sports have that need for a perception change at the moment as it is. I think probably the bigger challenge that many sports will have is more so about how you're nurturing and developing that next generation of fans. And you will hear people talk about this a lot, but more under the guise of, we're doing amazing engagement with the young people because we're on social media or we've got a website, and incredibly simple approaches, and almost just that. I hope this is working, as opposed to necessarily really being incredibly proactive. I think the various American leagues are a great example of what can be done. You take a sport like the NFL, which has so many aspects to it that if you're writing a sports textbook, you would say this sport should be dead, or it should be on its way to being dead. It's incredibly violent. Players are hidden behind helmets. It is incredibly slow. It takes 4 hours to play a game. It has incredibly complex rules. If you're literally developing something to be the textbook version of a sport that should not be successful in the modern age and should not be proliferating around young fans, the NFL is probably not a bad example. But on the flip side, the NFL has a remarkable amount of initiatives that they take to try to bring in young fans. They've probably been criticised from some quarters in the States as to having fantasy football programs that are targeted at young fans, trying to position the NFL as a really safe, friendly, happy sport that's with a lot of advertising targeted towards mums who are very influential in the selection of sports, particularly at certain age groups. And yes, you can probably always find some principal reasons why that activity is good or bad, depending on your perspective. But they also, you know, genuinely devote resources, have clearly an incredibly good internal strategy team on that front that is almost guaranteeing that next generation of fans will continue to follow the NFL and follow it at an incredibly passionate level, and that is going to position them much better than a lot of other sports on that front. And there's probably not a huge amount of sports or leagues that I see that have that level of next generation fan development or recognition of how to actually actively cultivate and generate those fans. And a lot of it is being left to the hope of hopefully social media and the different personalities will be the sort of individuals that will continue to be popular and continue to influence, or parents essentially bringing them forward as fans of a sport because they grew up as fans of a particular sport. And it's a really, really challenging thing to do, because you go back in the day, even when I was growing up, of there being, maybe 5, 6, 7 television channels. And, when the Sunday rugby league match was on, or when the Olympics was on, if you're a sports fan, that's what you sat down and watched. Obviously now there's an immense amount of entertainment opportunities both within and outside sport, and so there, inevitably you are not going to have the same mass appeal for single events unless you happen to be one of those ones that just creates this hyper amount of interest. And that's, I think, where you're seeing so much of the commercial money and the investment going towards a certain key group of sports properties or sports in and of themselves, because they're the ones that people are looking at and going, actually, there is a momentum or a core group that is almost self-amplifying the interest in this, and many others which are unfortunately going the other way.
Brilliant. Well, we'll have to keep talking to people in that space to find out some of those details.
It's a really, really interesting area, and one of which I suspect you'll see more and more people come out with a specific expertise in the coming years, and probably a space that really needs it as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Andrew. We really appreciate your time, and thanks for sticking around a bit longer to chat.
Not a problem at all, guys. Thank you. Really, really enjoyed the chat, and really enjoy, as I said, listening to the show, and looking forward to plenty more good episodes in the future.
Alrighty, Rubes. Wowee. What an episode. I actually think that was probably the most in-depth episode we've had. Like, we just we dug and we dug and we dug, and we got to the very bottom of meteorites. I'm not going to say I'm an expert, but wow, like, there was a lot covered, which was unreal.
Yeah, you're dead right. And finally, someone explained to me what OTT stands for and what it means.
I feel like I've seen that for so long, and now I finally get it. It's a good day.
I just loved how, like, you look at someone like FIBA and the eventual broadcaster, but you don't actually realize who's in between. Like, for example, the people who FIBA have a joint venture with, DAZN. But then there's also, people like WSC Sports who clip up all the highlights and put these packages together to sell the extra bits to the broadcaster as well. Like, there's so many different people involved that you just have no idea about when you're looking at it on your TV from your couch.
Yeah. It's a good point, because if you, when you watch the basketball or the footy or the cricket, it kind of, it looks like they've just quickly chopped something up. Like, say a player has just stood out and they want to show some highlights. It's like, if you actually think about it, it's like they would have had to know that player was going to play well or whatever to have that ready to go. So, like, it does make sense that someone's just gone and clicked them up, making this press play, and that's it. But yeah, no, it was just cool hearing, like, and even just the pitch stages and, like, the process they go to get over the line. And I loved how the pitch changes depending on the market. Like, for Australia, it was like the pitches all around how the Boomers did so well in the Olympics. We've got all these next gen stars going to the NBA. That's completely different to, like, a country like Latvia, who's or Lithuania, who's had this rich history of basketball superstars playing for them. They've sort of gone a little bit downhill in recent years in terms of results, but like it's like their national passion and love is that basketball team. So it just completely changes, which is something I haven't really thought about.
Yeah. Little known fact, the SportsGrad podcast does quite well in the Baltics, for those
Yeah,
wondering.
yeah. I'd love to reel off some numbers, but I don't have them handy. But yeah,
We'll,
it was interesting.
we'll have a meetup in Vilnius at some point.
Yeah, I would have thought so. It makes a lot of sense. What I will say though, that those listening, Andrew said his passion, well, not his passion, wasn't really his passion to start, but what he was really curious about growing up was sort of who broadcasts the sport. And he mentioned the NRL and AFL and how that can change. And here in Australia, it's 7, 9, and 10 who are sort of like the big players in broadcast. So I'd encourage people, when you're watching your sport tomorrow or on the weekend, just be quite curious about how it's different. We're lucky in Australia where or all over the globe, there's multiple broadcasters who do different sports, and they often change from year to year. And just look at how it's different for sport to sport, and get curious about it. Because if you actually spend some time, looking at it and actually with intent of seeing how it's actually being broadcast, you'll find it is quite different from sport to sport. So I encourage people to do that if you are interested after that chat with Andrew.
And you start to realize how every single detail has some sort of, legality around it, what they are allowed to do, what they are not allowed to do. There's all these different intricacies. Like everything has an absolute reason, whether, the commentators are allowed on the ground, or they've got to be in the studio, or they've got to cut to an ad break, or they can play the entire quarter or match or whatever. Everything's got a reason. So yeah, keep your eye out for those little intricacies, Ryan.
Absolutely. Well, we'll wrap it there. But thanks so much for listening. Be sure to connect with us on LinkedIn. We'd love to chat with you and answer any questions you've got. You can find a link to those in the show notes. Thanks for listening. Until next time.